On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we're going to talk about austerity with the economist Mark Blyth.
You can punish people if the economy bounces back. They'll take a hit for a few years and they'll forget it and they'll forgive. But if you've said to them, in order to have a basic lower middle class lifestyle, you need to be in debt up to your eyeballs, then you have a crisis and then you say, I'm going to cut everything. There's no way the economy can grow fast enough or their incomes can grow fast enough to actually pay all this stuff off. So it's just a game of fictions.
On Contact, neoliberalism, patriotism. Truth is not socialism, obedience, state, class war, corporate dictatorship, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolt unmasked. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Austerity, the policy of carrying out draconian budget cuts through the cutting of state spending to solve debt and growth problems, is sold to us, as the economist Mark Blyth points out, through a combination of morality and seduction. We are told that we are living beyond our means and must carry out fiscal responsibility. But absent from this argument is the fact that taxpayers have been looted of trillions of dollars to bail out bankers. This is what led to our massive deficit, and we, the victims, are being made to pay for it. Austerity, which involves the slashing of government services, reductions in pension payments, and a decline in wages, ultimately leads, we are assured, to investment. Investment leads to growth, and growth leads to prosperity. But the opposite has happened. Income inequality, debt, and poverty have expanded. Austerity has been a disaster, but it remains the driving ideology of corporate capitalism. And this is because austerity works for those who impose it, the rich. RT correspondent Anya Parampil examines the cost that austerity has exacted on the working class and the poor.
Since the global financial collapse of 2008, Americans have been waiting for an economic recovery which hasn't come. Since 2006, only Americans in the top income brackets have seen their incomes increase, causing Bloomberg to declare in 2015, the richest Americans are winning the economic recovery. The rest of us have been left behind, subject to what's become the economic buzzword of the last several years, austerity. Austerity is when, rather than invest in revamping and rebooting the economy, the government tightens its purse strings and actually cuts funding to social programs. And Obama set himself up for an austere presidency when he extended the Bush tax cuts in 2010 and made them permanent 2 years later. An analysis from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities demonstrates that over time, those tax cuts will be the greatest contributor to the deficit, meaning no money for public programs. In fact, after Obama signed the 2013 budget, the White House boasted on its website, the president has signed $1 trillion in discretionary spending cuts into law through the Budget Control Act. And his budget calls for more than $340 billion in entitlement savings from Medicare and Medicaid, and $250 billion from other mandatory programs. Tax cuts for the wealthy meant not only could there not be a serious jobs program after the recession, but that cuts to basic services like Medicaid that Americans have depended on for decades were also made. And as long as that money doesn't trickle down naturally, it seems as though the recovery will continue to be slow and unequal for most.
Mark Blyth is a professor of international political economy at Brown University. He is the refreshingly blunt and lucid author of Austerity, the History of a Dangerous Idea, an economist and political theorist who, rather than obscures the truth, strives to elucidate it. Mark, thanks.
Pleasure.
So let's talk about this mechanism of austerity, which after especially the global financial crash of 2008 has been the weapon in the hands of the elites, wielded against the rest of us. How did it come to pass, and how do they rationalize it?
All right, so let's take the two of them. How did it come to pass? Well-known fact now that private credit growth before the crisis, 10 years before, very, very high in a way that hadn't been historically, right throughout all the developed countries. Possible exception of places like Italy, right? But that's where it goes. Now, why is that? Because you've got stagnant wages. So we know the story about stagnant wages. Basically, if you go to the bottom 60% of the US income distribution, include inflation, you haven't had a real wage increase since some people date 1979. So you fill it in with credit. All right? So what's this doing? It's adding leverage to bank balance sheets, all this sort of stuff. It's all good so long as the music keeps going. The music stops when the mortgages start to default. At that point, you've got huge, highly levered financial institutions that constitute, in terms of their assets, percentages of GDP in the order of 10 or 12.
Just explain leveraging, I mean, what that means.
Basically, I have this much stuff that I can swap for cash if I'm in trouble. I have my loan book that's this height. So if my loans go bad by this much, technically I'm underwater. And if my investors see that, they dump my equity and I fall to zero. All these banks are each other's hedges. They're all each other's contract holders. We discover systemic risk. The governments of the world crap themselves, excuse my language, because that's what happened. They suddenly discovered they had this huge financial liability. They had to bail it out, and bail it out they did. But the minute you do that, what you're doing is you're taking private debt and guaranteeing it through bailouts, recapitalizations, cushioning the effects of recession by generating a huge amount of public debt. Now, the markets who have just been bailed out, they don't like all that public debt, which is actually a lie they do because it's an asset. We can get to that if you want. But they want that cut. Now, how are you going to cut that? You have to cut down government spending. Well, who cuts down government? Who benefits from government spending? The bottom of the income distribution that's already up to the net in the private debt, which has just been bailed out. So I like to call this, in the language of finance, a class-specific put option.
And in your book, you talk about why the elites cannot be honest about what they're doing.
Absolutely.
And give us the arguments that they use and why they're completely specious.
All right, first one, we've all got to tighten our belts.
Right.
There's too much debt, right? Fine. As I put it in the book, the minute we're all wearing the same trousers, I'll tighten my belt. Some people's trousers are way bigger. Second one is people confuse debt and what a debt is. It's not just this bad thing. Debt on the private side or the public side is an asset. The people who got bailed out got their assets bailed out. Very, very simple way of thinking about this. I have a mortgage. You might have a mortgage. Somebody watching might have a mortgage. That to a bank is a liability. They don't want your house. They want the income stream coming from it. My asset is my house. My liability is paying the mortgage. It all sums to zero. When you bail out the assets of a bank, you're bailing out the assets and incomes of the top 20% of the income distribution, particularly those of the very top. So when you've just done that, they're not going to turn around and say, hey, maybe we should pay some extra taxes because we got bailed out. No, they want to put that on the other part of the income distribution, the ones who are now being told, we can't have this, you need to pay more, your education can't be free, etc.
And one of the points you make is that for the elites, the austerity programs don't actually affect them because their children are not going to public schools. They are not dependent on welfare. They can live in hermetic worlds that are divorced from social services and government programs that are vital for the underclass.
Absolutely. Not just the underclass, the middle class. It used to be the case that Pell Grants constituted 40% of the cost of education. Now it's a fraction of that. Congress has done nothing to stop student debt building up at the same time as incomes have stagnated. A definition of a bubble is you have a huge amount of debt and the income stream coming in to support it can't pay for the debt.
Which is what's happening with student debt.
That's what's happening with student debt. This is all a consequence of belt tightening for some, but not for those with the most.
And so austerity, although you marshal the evidence in your book, although it is a program that not only doesn't work but has never worked, it continues as policy because austerity is a mechanism by which you prohibit inflation and by which you make the underclass pay for essentially the private activities of banks.
Absolutely.
Hedge funds.
I mean, think about this in terms of who gets to vote. So everybody in principle gets to vote in a democracy, but who actually votes? Turns out the poor don't turn out. Turns out the old with assets turn out way more even than young people. So how is that going to be skewed? I want my pension protected. Damn right you're going to pay for that bailout, even though I'm morally against it. So you end up with a politics that pushes governments in the direction of always saving financial institutions and then putting the costs on those who, guess what, probably don't vote for them.
Talk a little bit about the downward spiral, which we especially see in Europe, but also in the United States, of continuing a policy that hasn't worked and isn't going to work.
This is the most puzzling aspect of this from any kind of like neutral perspective. From political perspective, we just explained it, but let's think about it this way. So bear with me for a minute. Imagine the economy is a sum, and on the top you put the number 100, and on the bottom you put the number 100. So the 100 on the top's the debt, 100 on the bottom's the economy. You've got a 100% debt to GDP ratio. Now we've got to cut spending, we're in trouble. So let's slash 20 off the bottom, we'll cut spending by 20%. Your debt to GDP ratio, 100 over 80, is now 120. You can generate more debt the more you shrink. Heard of Greece? Right, Greece has had a 57% increase in its debt since the financial crisis and the bailouts that it was given. Because of the bailouts, in the terms of the bailouts, which shrunk the underlying economy and meant that the debt on the top got bigger rather than smaller, even though they haven't issued a bond in years. That's the incredible inequity that goes with this. Now, why are you doing this? Because you're guaranteeing the sanctity of the contracts of the bondholders who are already there. They will be paid. That is the mantra of the German finance ministry and also more sotto voce, the Italians running the European Central Bank.
And yet it's a dead-end game.
Of course it's a dead-end game, because here's why. In the past, you could almost do this if you had much higher rates of growth in the global economy as we had in the post-war period, or if people were less indebted on the personal side, right? So you can punish people if the economy bounces back. They'll take a hit for a few years, and they'll forget it, and they'll forgive. But if you've said to them, in order to have a basic lower middle-class lifestyle, you need to be in debt up to your eyeballs, then you have a crisis, and then you say, I'm going to cut everything, there's no way the economy can grow fast enough or their incomes can grow fast enough to actually pay all this stuff off. So it's just a game of fictions. They keep rolling it over. Bankers call it extend and pretend. That's exactly what it is, no more so than in Greece.
But it's terminal.
It is terminal. I mean, think about Greece. Greece has lost nearly 30% of GDP, depending on how you count it, 30% of final consumption, about 20% of the economy in general. Anyone with skills and talent has left. You're left with a bunch of pensioners. They don't export much. What exactly is the end game? Nothing. Just simply extend and pretend.
And you've seen this in Eastern Europe. I mean, 2 million Poles work abroad, almost all of them young people.
Absolutely. And of course, people point to the Latvian miracle that proves austerity. I mean, it's a country that's half the size of Brooklyn, New York, that basically intermediates tax dodges from Russia. And this is held up as a shining example by the global elite.
And
it's ridiculous.
Spends money buying weapons from NATO.
Yeah, yeah, really. That's a good value for money right there.
Great, thanks. When we come back, we'll hear more from economist Mark Blyth. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back. We'll continue our conversation with Professor Mark Blyth, author of Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. So austerity has been exacting more and more blood, both within the European economy, the EU, as well as within the United States, and you're seeing rumblings of revolt. The Occupy movement would be an example, and Brexit. And maybe you can talk about what you see happening now within the political landscape, because austerity is not an economic, it's a political idea.
Absolutely. I'd also throw a lot of what's going on with Trump into this. I think it's very useful to take the left and the right distinction and throw it out for a minute. And just think about also the surge in support for the National Front. Is it because France
is in France?
In France. Is France constituted 34% by racists? I don't know, but I don't think so, right? So what's going on with this whole thing? There's a brilliant graph that's been generated by an economist called Branko Milanovic in his new book, Global Inequality. And what it does, it shows this kind of S-curve. Now, very briefly, what it does is says, if you're in the developing world over the past 30 years, because of neoliberalism and other factors, opening up to trade, China, etc., your income's been going up. When it starts to go down is the 65th percentile of the global income distribution. That's the poorest person in the United States. And it goes all the way down to the 87th and doesn't pick up again. That's the middle classes. That's their incomes being locked, beaten down, being told to pay more, permanent austerity, the whole lot. And there's a reaction that says, well, wait a minute here. I've done all the things you've told me. I've flexibilized, I've gotten out of unions, I've been mobile, I've taken on skills, I've taken on so much debt, it's ridiculous. Why are things not better? Why do I think my kids' future is going to be worse? And that inchoate set of rumblings, which found one voice in the financial crisis, has now really turned against the mainstream parties in Europe. If you look, I'll give you one example. The Social Democrats in Germany, they got 19% in the last election in an area of Germany called Baden-Württemberg. That's unthinkable. They're on 2 cycles away from being a dead party. The British Labour Party, exactly the same. The Democrats might be going the same way. There's a big set of revolts going on, and Brexit is very similar. It's not about Europe. It's an opportunity to give the elites a big telling off, and that's exactly what it was.
And what do you, when you look at Brexit, what do you see coming out of that severance of the United Kingdom from the EU? Is this going to trigger a kind of domino effect with other countries leaving the EU?
That's the fear. Whether it does or not, I don't know. I mean, one of the ways I think about this is the effect being Scottish, right, and what happens with Scotland. So Scotland's now in a wonderfully peculiar position. Having said they didn't want independence in a referendum a couple of years back, they voted 61-62% to stay in the EU, while Britain said 52% were out. In the north of England, paradoxically, that bit which still does manufacturing, for example, Nissan cars, and is dependent on access to the European market, they voted 61% to get out. Now, what's Scotland going to do in this one? Should they try and get out? Well, if they do, they have to join the euro. And the euro is way more punishing and way more brutal in terms of austerity than being in Britain. So do you leave NATO? They said they wanted to leave NATO. Really, where are the Brits going to park their nukes? Do you think they're going to take that one lying down? Which are in Scotland, not in Great Britain. There's nowhere else in Britain to put them. So all of these geopolitical consequences, long term, are tied into it, right? Now, in the short term, what does it actually mean? They don't know. My favourite tweet when Brexit happened was somebody put up, Merkel, what do you want? May, Brexit means Brexit. Merkel, you've no idea what you want. Correct, right? And that's where they are, because the elites didn't want this, but now they're stuck with it, because that's the thing about democracy. Unless you really are just making a fake of it, you kind of have to do what the people want. And now they're trying to figure out what that actually means.
But what are the consequences of that, do you think?
It could go in multiple ways. At the end of the day, Europe is still the most integrated trading area on the planet. The Brits are not in the euro, so they don't have the severance costs of doing that redenomination, really complex. They're still a huge financial power, right, a neoliberal powerhouse. All of that's going to continue. So is it going to be like catastrophic? Also, is it in the interest of Europe to really punish Britain? No, because that will hurt themselves, because they're so tightly bound. So to me, over the short term, we're looking for a lot of kind of volatility, as they say in markets, which might not be there. It's only when they've really decided what they're going to do that we'll know what it means. And that's getting kicked further and further out because they don't want to deal with it.
Well, you always talk in the book about kicking the can further down the road, that they're not dealing with the crisis, they're just delaying the inevitability of the crisis. What does the crisis look like? I mean, we see the tremors of it now.
The crisis in the long run is when governing elites in democracies basically give up on giving any notion of hope as a message, which is what's happened, right? Then why should we vote for them? Why shouldn't we listen to the voices of opposition, regardless of they're populist or left or right or whatever? And what we're seeing, as I said earlier, is this collapse in support, particularly for the traditional centre-left. Your New Labour, gone. That's finished. The SPD, gone. They're almost dead. Great example, Swedish Social Democrats. These guys ran the country for 44 years. Continually. You could put up a dead dog with a red rosette in Södermalm and you would get elected with 50,000 majority. Now they have to govern in coalition with a bunch of basically racists. Everything's changed and the elites are just beginning to figure this out. But here's the big problem. They refuse to take responsibility for it. There's no notion that the actions that they have undertaken as policies over the past 30 years.
Party.
Exactly.
But and what you've seen on the outer reaches of the EU in countries like Hungary and Poland is the rise of proto-fascism.
Absolutely. Authoritarianism. At its base, authoritarianism in this way. Let's not say fascism, because people generally think Nazis, right? Genocidal Nazis. We're not talking about that. We're talking about something equally ugly, right? The notion that protection starts at home. And in order to do that, you have to define what home is and who belongs in the home. And that's what all these regimes have in common. And if we think that this is purely a trait of, the Hungarians, etc., remember that when he was on the way out, that famous line by then British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, British jobs for British workers. That could have been said by a populist anywhere. So when the rubber hits the road, to use a more polite expression than the one that I had in my mind, these guys tend to go for that type of politics which becomes authoritarian. What you're just seeing in the Eastern European space is just a much more advanced version of it.
Well, you're watching it in the United States, as you pointed out. You're watching it in France. You're seeing tremors of this in Italy. The Italian financial system is
not in good shape.
Extremely fragile. Is this engine of austerity pushing us towards a form of authoritarian despotism?
It's not just austerity. Let's say austerity is kind of the catalyst and the accelerant. Let's think about how we got here in the long run. Go back to your first question, right? You go back to the 1970s, very interesting world. Labour's share of national income was never higher. Profits were at an all-time low. Inflation was high. Parliaments were strong. Nobody had ever heard of a central banker. 30 years later, it's the complete opposite. So the reaction that produced neoliberalism, the 70s, stagflation, all this, the rise of the business class running politics, has produced a world in which interest rates are on the floor, inflation's practically negative, growth is on the floor. How long can you sustain that and expect people to pay for debts that they themselves didn't accumulate?
While you have zombie banks, especially in Germany, and you have the games of speculation, the casino capitalism, all of which there has to be ramifications of this.
Well, they will be shielded against it in terms of its juridical consequences.
They will, but we won't.
But we won't, exactly. The notion of another financial crisis coming, that one I'm sceptical of, in the sense that if you go inside these institutions, the one complaint they all have is now they've got 5 compliance managers for every deal. We've shut them down on a micro level. They're no longer as profitable as they were. That's okay, but the next trick is, how do you get growth going again? How do you get jobs and opportunity going again? If you're closing down the casino economy, what's next? I don't see any of the mainstream leaders having a good answer to that.
Well, let's talk about the mainstream leaders, both within the Democratic and Republican establishments, because they cling to the mantra of austerity, despite the fact that it hasn't worked. Do you think that they're just cynical and it's self-interest, or do you think that they're stupid?
I think that within the Democrats, there is actually a distinction to be made. There's people such as Paul Krugman, for example, who has never thought this is a good idea. There are people who have flip-flopped on the issue over time. You can find anyone you want. They understand, at the end of the day, that if everybody tries to save at once, the only thing that can happen is the economy will shrink. They're just a little bit more cognizant of the fact that their constituency might get hurt. And that's why they're a little bit more proactive against it. The Republicans have no such shame. They're just straight out for it because somebody else pays for the damage. So within that, there's a little bit of room for wiggle, but essentially, no, there's not much room for new policies. How do you think about transforming the opportunities of 20 and 30-year-olds now? Why are millennials more in debt and yet less likely to achieve the income gains?
We hear them chanting, we were talking about Thomas Frank's new book, where he does a nice kind of profile of this. They chant this mantra of innovation.
Yeah.
As if that's a rational response to deindustrialization.
Well, you know, I always like the line by Ha-Joon Chang on this, the economist. He says, which country has the most entrepreneurs? And the answer is India, and the reason is because that's what you do when you can't get a job. So it depends on what you mean by innovation. So this kind of Schumpeterian fantasy that sort of the world is run by people like Elon Musk, etc. A favourite example of this, I don't have it on me, we switched it off, is the iPhone. Pick up your iPhone, it's got six critical components, right? 5 of them were directly the result of public investment in the United States. Lodestar, GPS, TCP/IP, they were all government projects that we handed to the private sector and people made a fortune off of. I want my equity share. Why don't we have that discussion? So there are things that government could do. Fiscal policy would be the most obvious one. But we've scared ourselves into a position of financial dominance that we refuse to even contemplate alternatives, which are very easy to do.
And as you look at the weak economies in Europe, and you look at the half of the United States now living in poverty, and you look at the inability of the elites to veer away from this ideology, what do you see happening to these economies? The creation of a kind of neo-feudal order? Where are we going?
Well, you know, and again, it depends on what your relative baseline is. So the East Europeans are a good example. You know, some of them are becoming very much more authoritarian. Others aren't. Romania's an interesting example of this, right? It was a large economy out there. There's an interesting thing that's happened in terms of, if you think about the baseline for East European economies in terms of wages and incomes being pretty low, and then Western Europe being very high, where have the Germans who export all their stuff been moving their supply chain? East. Now, that's real income gains for the people in the East, and that's the 8% surplus for the Germans. Now, the problem is, under the euro, what does France and Spain and Italy do? If you're in the same currency, you're meant to run a deficit to contract their surplus.
Right.
You're not allowed to by the rules. So they're being asked to run permanently tight policies while the rest of these guys make out on exports. I don't see that one ending too well. That's going to be a product line that basically goes from Italy to France to Spain. Italy hasn't grown more than 1% since it joined the euro. It's the same size it was in 1992. With an old population, that's unsustainable.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Pleasure.
That was Professor Mark Blyth, author of Austerity, the History of a Dangerous Idea. Austerity passes the cost of the financial elite's massive fraud and criminal activity to us. The rich, who are bailed out at taxpayer expense, are not affected by austerity measures. Their children attend private schools. They don't use government services such as welfare, student loan services, or Social Security. They select and fund our political candidates to exclude anyone who might challenge their privilege and entitlement. They are not affected by soaring health care costs or trashed or non-existent pension funds. Austerity is our problem. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton will not obstruct the exacting cost of austerity, even as it distorts our economy into a form of neo-feudalism, of masters and serfs. If we want to halt the pillage, we will have to carry out acts of non-cooperation and civil disobedience. Only then can we free ourselves from the chains of austerity forged by our corporate oligarchs. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.